The village of Cheltenham, nestled amidst rolling hills and hedgerows, prided itself on a serene pace of life. Here, the seasons changed with measured grace, and gossip travelled no faster than the baker's cart. In such a place, Harriet Grant was a name often spoken with hushed curiosity. Not disdain, not unkindness, but something akin to bewilderment. For 25, Harriet remained unwed, her life untouched by the rhythms that guided the other young women of Cheltenham. Her family resided in the stately but ageing Grant house, its stone facade ivy-clad and its gardens meticulously tended by her mother, Agnes. Her father, Francis, devoted himself to the estate's finances, though they teetered perpetually on the brink of ruin. Within these walls, Harriet existed in a curious limbo, neither child nor fully grown in the eyes of her parents. She awoke early that morning, as she always did, the sun barely cresting the horizon. Her room was her sanctuary, a space dominated by bookshelves that bowed under the weight of volumes, their spines worn from constant use. A desk stood by the window, cluttered with papers covered in Harriet's precise handwriting. Her latest project, an exhaustive catalogue of the flora and fauna of the Grant grounds, was spread across the surface. "Harriet!" came her mother's voice from the foot of the stairs. It was brisk as usual, edged with the exasperation that often coloured their interactions. "Breakfast?" she called. Harriet sighed, carefully arranging her papers before descending. The dining room was already alive with the clatter of dishes and her father's steady drone about the declining quality of the village's barley crop. Her younger sisters, Jane and Eleanor, were not there. They lived with their respective husbands in bustling market towns miles away, returning only for holidays. Their absence was a constant reminder of Harriet's solitude. Her mother's eyes flicked to her as she entered, assessing her wrinkled muslin dress and the unruly waves of her untamed brown hair. Harriet felt the familiar sting of that glance, though she said nothing. Instead, she seated herself quietly and reached for the bread. "You might consider taking tea with Mrs. Weatherby this afternoon," her mother began, her tone carefully casual. "She mentioned her nephew is visiting from London." Harriet's teacup paused halfway to her mouth. "I have no interest in tea with Mrs. Weatherby or her nephew," she said, her voice even. Her mother sighed. "Harriet, you cannot go on like this. Do you wish to live here forever, alone?" "I am not alone," Harriet replied, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "And I have work to do." "Your books and lists are not work," her father interjected, glancing up from his plate. "They are distractions." Harriet said nothing more, retreating behind the armour of silence she had learned to wield so well. After breakfast, she escaped to the gardens, where the air was cool and the world seemed quieter. She walked the paths with a notebook in hand, jotting observations about the changing leaves and the movement of sparrows in the hedges. It was here, among the flowers and trees, that she felt most herself. Yet even here, the loneliness pressed in. She could not deny that she yearned for connection, for someone who might understand the thoughts that raced through her mind and the emotions she struggled to articulate. But in Cheltenham, where the measure of a woman's worth was her ability to host a supper or dance gracefully at a ball, Harriet Grant was an enigma. That evening, as the house settled into its nightly routine, Harriet lingered by the fire in the drawing room, her thoughts heavy. She could hear her parents' murmured voices in the study, no doubt discussing her, as they often did. The words were indistinct, but their tone was unmistakable: worry, frustration, and, most painful of all, resignation. Harriet clenched her fists in her lap, her resolve hardening. She would not be a burden, a puzzle to be solved or a project to be completed. She would find her own path, but even that notion felt exceedingly challenging. As Harriet sat by the fire, her notebook open on her lap, the rhythmic scratching of her pencil filled the quiet drawing room. She was listing the birds she had observed that afternoon, cataloguing their colours and behaviours with the same precision she always brought. It soothed her, this routine, even as a familiar ache of loneliness stirred beneath the surface. The quiet was interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Startled, she glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was well past the hour for her mother or father to come fetch her. Setting her notebook aside, Harriet rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt before answering. To her surprise, it was the maid, clutching a small folded note in her hands. "Miss Grant, this came for you." Harriet gave a muddled blink but took the note, her curiosity piqued. She unfolded it slowly, the handwriting unfamiliar but neat and civilized. "Dear Miss Grant, I hope you will forgive the liberty I take in writing this, but a mutual acquaintance has spoken highly of your intelligence and character. I wonder if you might consider joining me for tea this Thursday at 3 o'clock at the Red Fern Tea Room. It would be a pleasure to make your acquaintance in person. Should you accept, I would be most pleased. Yours respectfully, a gentleman." Harriet gawked at the letter, her cheeks warming as 100 thoughts jostled for attention. A gentleman? A mutual acquaintance? She read the note again, slower this time, her fingers tightening slightly on the paper. "What shall you decide, miss?" the maid asked, her tone curious and eager. Harriet hesitated, her heart tugging in two directions. One part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat into the safety of her books and lists, but another part, a quieter, braver part, whispered something else. This was so unusual, unexpected. Perhaps even an opportunity, or a horrid joke. She paused, her pulse quickening. "Let me think." As the maid nodded and withdrew, Harriet sat back down, staring at the note. For all her uncertainty, the words clung to her thoughts, stirring something, sparks of great possibility and fear. She folded the note and set it beside her, her mind racing. Tea with a stranger. What could they possibly want with me? And yet, as the fire crackled softly, Harriet Grant found herself imagining for the first time what might happen if she said yes.